2020. Headline CPI inflation is expected to peak at around 5.9% in the second quarter of 2019. The forecast for core inflation is 4.4% in 2018, 5.6% in 2019, and 5.5% in 2020. The impact of the value-added tax increase continues to be muted. The more elevated headline inflation trajectory is explained by the weaker rand exchange rate and higher oil prices. Average wage growth is expected to remain elevated at around 7% over the forecast period. Much of the upward pressure on wage inflation arises from the public sector wage settlements, which are at levels above headline inflation. Wage growth is an important driver of services price inflation. Elevated international oil prices will continue to fuel price inflation. Other administered prices are expected to increase at rates above the upper end of the inflation target range as water and electricity tariffs rise alongside rates and taxes in major metros. The impact on headline inflation continues to be moderated by lower food price inflation. Inflation expectations, as reflected in the survey conducted by the Bureau for Economic Research during the third quarter of 2018, are marginally higher, averaging 5.3% in 2018 and 5.6% in 2019 and in 2020. 5-year inflation expectations have increased marginally to 5.5%. Inflation expectations implicit in break-even inflation rates have continued to edge upwards across all maturities. While the global economic outlook is expected to remain broadly favorable over the short term, medium-term risks are tilted to the downside due to elevated policy uncertainty. This uncertainty arises from escalating trade tensions and tightening global financial conditions. The global inflation outlook is on a moderate upward path, largely due to rising oil prices and higher GDP growth rates in some advanced economies. Since the July MPC, the rand has depreciated by 7.3% against the US dollar, by 8.1% against the euro, and by 7.1% on a trade-weighted basis. At current levels, the SARB model assesses the rand to be undervalued. The implied starting point for the rand is 14 rands 20 against the US dollar, compared with 13 rands 40 at the time of the previous meeting. Tighter global financial conditions and the change in investor sentiment towards emerging markets remains key external risks to the rand, and it is likely that the rand, along with other emerging market currencies, will remain volatile. However, the pace of monetary policy normalization in the advanced economies continues to be gradual, and further policy tightening by the US Fed is expected to follow a measured path in the absence of significant inflation or growth surprises. The domestic economy has entered a technical recession following 2 consecutive quarters of contracting economic activity. Quarter-on-quarter GDP contracted by 0.7% in the second quarter, and GDP data for the first quarter was revised down from minus 2.2% to minus 2.6%. However, on a year-on-year basis, GDP growth in the first quarter was 0.8% and 0.4% in the second quarter. The SARB now forecasts growth in 2018 to average 0.7%. The forecast for 2019 and 2020 is unchanged at 1.9% and 2% respectively. At these growth rates, the negative output gap is wider in the near term, but is still expected to close by the end of 2020 as GDP growth rates exceed potential growth. The SARB composite leading business cycle indicator increased in June, largely reflecting an improvement in the measures of external sector activity. However, business confidence, as reflected in the RMB BER Business Confidence Index, decreased to 38 index points in the third quarter. Growth in gross fixed capital formation is expected to remain weak. Household consumption expenditure contracted by 1.3% in the second quarter, declining for the first time in 2 years. In the medium term, the increase in disposable income is expected to be supportive of consumption expenditure. However, household consumption expenditure is likely to be constrained by recent tax changes, weak employment growth, as well as subdued growth in credit extension to households. Although credit extension to households has been increasing during 2018, year-on-year growth remains low. The MPC noted the rising inflation trajectory, which, while remaining within the target range, is moving further away from the midpoint of the target range. The MPC assesses the risks to the inflation outlook to be on the upside. The committee remains concerned about growing risks to the inflation outlook, mainly due to exchange rate risks related to both domestic and external factors, elevated international oil prices, and the possibility of higher electricity tariffs. However, demand pressures in the economy are not assessed to pose a significant risk to the inflation outlook. The MPC assesses the risks to the growth forecast to be moderately on the downside. The committee continues to be of the view that current challenges facing the economy are primarily structural in nature and cannot be solved by monetary policy alone. Commitment to credible structural policy initiatives and implementation thereof is required to make a marked impact on the cost structure of the economy, potential output, and employment. Monetary policy is most effective in addressing cyclical growth. The MPC has decided to keep the repurchase rate unchanged at 6.5% per annum. 4 members preferred an unchanged stance, and 3 members preferred a 25 basis points increase. The committee continues to assess the stance of monetary policy to be accommodative. However, the MPC remains concerned about the deteriorating inflation outlook, driven mainly by multiple supply-side factors. The approach of the committee continues to be to look through the first-round effects and focus on the possible second-round effects. With risks and uncertainties at higher levels, the MPC will continue to be vigilant and will not hesitate to act should it become necessary. The implied path of policy rates generated by the quarterly projection model is for 5 rate hikes of 25 basis points by the end of 2020. As emphasized previously, the implied path remains a broad policy guide which can and does change in either direction between meetings in response to new developments and changing risks. At this stage, I would like to invite the members of the media to pose any questions that you might have, and as usual, please identify yourself and the media house that you represent, and I will direct your questions to the relevant members of the panel. Yes, sir.
Good day. It's Mfuneko from Reuters News. Two questions, perhaps, if I could. The first one, for those three members who argued for a rate hike, what was the hoped-for effect of that rate hike? And the second question is, how important is the midpoint of the inflation range? Has it become more important than the actual range itself? And is the bank moving towards targeting that midpoint more than targeting the entire range? Thanks.
Mfuneko, your first question, you said about the three members, you said hopeful.
What impact did they hope that a rate hike would have had?
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
It's Ntando from Bloomberg News. Now that you've kept the rates unchanged and you didn't raise rates, does the SARB not risk falling behind the tightening curve after Russia and Turkey hiked, and given that the Fed might also hike again next week?
One more? Yes, Mfuneko.
Sorry, there's a point in the statement where, Governor, you say that demand pressures in the economy don't pose a risk to inflation. If that is the case, did the MPC not see this as an opportunity, perhaps, to hike rates, perhaps, if there aren't any demand pressures, and do they see those demand pressures increasing in the future? Thanks.
One more. Okay. When you decide to adjust the policy rate in either direction, you expect to have an impact on inflation. So, as you could see from the statement that there were members who preferred that we increase the rate by 25 basis points, and there were members who preferred that we should actually keep it the same. So in both instances, you either take a view when you say they are remaining unchanged that the risks are not immediate and you have got to wait and see the risks materializing. And if you think that you wanted to hike, you'd say that, well, the risk might be materializing earlier, they are immediate, and therefore you should be acting now. What is in no doubt in that debate is that the focus is on what the inflation outlook is and what should monetary policy be doing about it. The argument could have gone the other way if the risks to the inflation outlook were on the downside and you started to deliberate about the possible cut in rates, you would be raising exactly the same points. In this meeting, there was no debate of any rate cut. But this very first question that you raised seems to contradict the last question that you had asked, which says that in the absence of demand pressures, wasn't it an opportunity for the MPC to hike? Well, if there aren't demand pressures that suggest to you that inflation is coming from the supply side, and if it is a supply shock, you then have to assess whether this is once off or whether it fits itself into domestic price formation. And if it fits itself into domestic price formation, a reference is made in the statement to second round effects. And if you think there is a possibility of second round effects kicking in, then policy has to respond appropriately. How important is the 4.5% target? Is the midpoint of the inflation target range? Target is the midpoint of the inflation target range. Very important. Why is it important? Firstly, is that our inflation target range is broad compared to the inflation target of other inflation targeters. It was done for a reason. It was done to give us flexibility such that when we have a shock, we have got room to maneuver within the inflation target. But the narrative that had been building over the years and the conduct of analysts and price setters in the economy seemed to suggest that they think that we are actually targeting 6%. So when inflation gets just below 6% at 5.9 or something, you will find this chorus that says that, oh, there is a room to cut. And when it goes to the other side of 6%, or it is still close to 6%. And the problem with that kind of narrative is that it then anchors inflation expectations at the wrong end, which then says that when you experience a shock, your ability to take a measured approach to the shock becomes constrained, and you might end up actually acting in a manner that might harm the economy. If you have inflation anchored closer to the midpoint of the target range, you have got much more room to maneuver, and should you experience a shock, the framework that we have, which is flexible inflation targeting, then really becomes flexible within the target range, not flexible outside of the target range. Flexible outside of the target range. The older journalists would remember that the inflation targeting framework used to have something called the escape clause, which meant that if the thing is outside of the target, you just press escape and then explain how do I get back into the inflation target range. And that is not useful for the framework, and it is for that reason that it was changed and said that continuously the Reserve Bank must explain what has happened to inflation and what is the inflation outlook looks like, and respond appropriately to make sure that inflation stays within the target. In this uncertain environment, in the global markets, it is always preferable that you have inflation and inflation expectations closer to the midpoint, because should these uncertainties arise, you have got room to maneuver. And Tando, is the Reserve Bank falling behind the tightening curve? You seem to suggest that there is a tightening curve somewhere. And let me say to you categorically once again that we look at the South African business cycle and we respond to the business cycle and how it impacts on the inflation outlook. We assess what is going on globally. And when we assess what is going on globally, we are more interested in what those developments mean for the South African economic outlook, both on the growth side and on the inflation side. And based on our assessment of how it impacts on the South African economy, we respond appropriately. We do not try and match basis point for basis point what the others are doing, because they are responding to their own domestic conditions, and it is important that we also respond to our own domestic conditions. And as we highlight in this statement, our assessment based on global developments and domestic economic developments, our assessment is that the risks to the inflation outlook are on the upside, and on the growth side, they are on the downside. And what that means is that the Reserve Bank must continue to assess the data and look at what the data says, and based on what the data says, respond appropriately. There is a button which shows a face in front there.
Okay. So, Governor, just to follow up on the question, I mean, you assess the inflation expected or the inflation outlook to be quite close to peak close to your target or upper end, upper range of the target. I wondered, do you have an assessment about the chances of an overshoot? And then, in that case, do you have a sense or do you feel that the current stance will give you enough flexibility if there is such an overshoot?
Tap.
Good afternoon, Governor. Despite the rand volatility, what are some of the risks that may manifest because of the current global trade war and actions that are taken by emerging economies in dealing with their currency issues?
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Governor. I'm Amogelang Bata from Bloomberg News. Governor, in the speech you mentioned a number of risks to the rand. We've also seen the rand being volatile, as you've said, you expect it to remain so. But certain policies that are particularly domestic policies, such as the land reform policy, for instance, has had an impact on the rand, and quite significantly. For instance, when the US President Donald Trump tweeted on the South African land reform program, that really sent quite a shockwave in the currency. Do you assess the land reform policy as a risk to the rand?
Just a follow-up question, Governor. So you said that during the debate and discussions whether to hike or to keep on hold, the main thing that was debated was the inflation outlook and the risks to the inflation outlook. Were risks to growth looked at? Did you look at the possibility of a change in rates stimulating growth, be it in the short term or in the long term? Thank you.
Any others? Okay, let me deal with these other fellows, and then I will come to you, because you want my job. Maybe you should come here and answer the question. Lucanio, what are the chances of an overshoot? Well, in the forecast that we have not put any overshoot. Otherwise, we would have said to you, inflation will go outside of the range. We had, however, highlighted risks which, if they materialize, could take us outside of the target. And should our assessment, because remember, these things are risks, you don't have certainty. Should our assessment be that the risks are likely to materialize, we have got to respond to that, because that could change the inflation trajectory. And in assessing those risks, once you've decided that these risks have got a higher likelihood of occurring, what you would then do is you will rerun your forecast. And if you think that it will then throw you outside of your target range, you have got to act at that stage. You do not wait to fall outside of the target, because by that time it's too late, and you might find that you need to respond more aggressively than you would have otherwise had to respond if you acted earlier. Tsapo, the other risks, they spelled out in the statement. The oil price, the exchange rate, the faster tightening of monetary policy in the advanced economies than what is currently priced in by the markets. The trade tensions. The trade tensions could actually have a negative impact on global growth, one. Secondly is that the response by imposing tariffs in various other countries could themselves become inflationary. There is no doubt that the rise in tariffs in various countries is going to lead to a build-up or to a rise in inflation. And once you begin to have that, it changes the global inflation picture, because our assessment of the global inflation picture now is that whilst it is rising, it remains benign. Amukhelang, the volatility, we said that the rand is vulnerable to external factors, like the ones that I had spelled out. And then we said to domestic factors, what I would call our own idiosyncratic risks. They are varied. Don't ask me to pick up one and say, it is this particular one or is this particular one. You know, the domestic risk, it could amount to some policy being announced. It could amount to some policy maker making a reckless statement. There are all those idiosyncrasies that you would have to deal with. So I will not zero it down to one. And in responding to this, I wouldn't have to tweet it.
Well, it's breaking news this hour. The South African Reserve Bank deciding to keep interest rates unchanged. The repo rate remains at 6.5%, the prime lending rate at 10%. Of course, the governor there, Lesotho Kganyago, highlighting the key reasons for why the MPC decided to keep rates unchanged at this point in time, despite the number of risks happening globally, and of course South Africa itself facing a few headwinds when it particularly comes to growth. So the big story, of course, from that, however, is that the rate does remain unchanged. I am joined in studio as well as we unpack a little bit of this decision. We've got Mamel Longwenya, who is the chief economist at FNB, and I've also got Ian Scott, who is head of fixed income as well at Momentum Investments. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. Mamelo, let's kick things off with you. The expectation here was indeed for interest rates to remain on hold. Do you think that they sat on their hands a little bit here?
Look, I think it was a tough one. And I think we see it in the split in votes, with 3 people voting for interest rates to go up. And I think a very important thing was highlighted in the statement, that demand remains quite weak. We saw it in the inflation print that came out yesterday, that core inflation remains relatively low. So although we've seen all of these shocks, particularly the rand and the petrol price having an impact on headline inflation, underlying inflationary pressures remain quite weak. And I think that the governor is right in saying that they are going to wait to see if there are second round effects to the inflation outlook, and they will look at the risk and assess the risks and act when required to.
Ian, no pressure indeed by the looks of things for the Reserve Bank to act when you take a look at the fact that inflation, the forecast itself, is set to perhaps peak at 5.9%. So it doesn't actually go outside the band, although it does peak outside of that. Do you think that they will fear that anything that happens means that they may have to move quite quickly?
Well, the SARB sits in a very tight position because we know we are in a recession, technical or not, we are in a recession. The consumer is really under fire. I think there's no easy decisions for the SARB at the moment. I think if they had to make the choice, and I think they did it this afternoon, is to keep rates where they are. I think the risk is that they feel, should they act when emerging markets are under pressure or not? But if I look at domestic fundamentals, I think it's quite important to try and keep the rates as low as long as possible, not to put the consumer, which is already under fire through petrol prices and VAT and all the other prices in the economy, not to increase interest rates as well as for as long as you can. I think we need to stimulate growth in this economy because we already have high real rates. This is not a high real rate story, it's a growth story.
Yeah, almost unmoved is the R186 that in the bond market, still above 9%, however. Do you fear that this still doesn't make us competitive in that market?
I think we're very competitive. If I go and look at over long term, the South African bond market, we feel, is probably one of the most compelling arguments in the fixed income sphere. If you look at a very long history, your 10-year bond should give you around 2.5% real over inflation. Sure. So if inflation over the next 2-3 years, as predicted by the SARB, averages around 5.5%, and you're getting a 9% yield on the government bond, that's 3.5% real. We think that's a very good opportunity given all the other risks in financial markets. We like the real yields. We think it's one of the allures of South African markets at this point in time is the high real yields we already have before we have rate hikes.
Mamelo, the governor also speaking there that you certainly need just one event to change things around. We could have a petrol price increase of more than R1, which is exactly what is expected next, to certainly hurt that inflation figure. How much pressure does that put on the Reserve Bank to keep vigilant and ensure that they don't fall behind?
I think it's quite important to look at sort of these external shocks in isolation. So when we do get a currency that depreciates, we do see the first impact through the petrol price, and it then filters into the headline inflation number. But we also need to think about, these massive increases that we're seeing on a year-on-year basis, with the disinflationary impact that it's going to have over time. Sure. So I think that they will look at the shocks in isolation, but I think that we need to look if there is demand pressure in the economy. So if we think about, I think the last two statements where the Reserve Bank had anticipated that core inflation would rise to 4.7%, we are at 4.2%. Our core inflation actually moved back a little bit in the last print, showing that there isn't any demand pressure. And I think that will be quite interesting to see if we actually get second round effects and how massive they are. So I think that they will look at these shocks in isolation and see how they sort of pan out over time. Yes, we did see the currency weaken quite a bit between July and August, for instance, but it has come back quite a bit. So I think that they'll be cognizant to look at those shocks properly.
Yeah, you speak of the rand. Just about as of 10 minutes ago, it was at around 14.38, which is the exact same market was at actually just before the governor announced his interest rates decision as well. Things like the rand, things like emerging markets, you've seen a constant hike in interest rates from Argentina going right up to 60%, Turkey going up to 24%. The currencies of emerging markets are continuously struggling. Is he perhaps falling behind the curve? Or is it the fact that we're not facing as big a crises as some of those countries?
Yes, I think we need to look at the idiosyncratic factors that have driven the currency weaknesses in those specific economies. Yes, we've seen that there's been this massive outflow of portfolio flows out of emerging markets on the back of trade wars and concerns around China and so on. I think that it's been overdone. We are anticipating that the currency should retreat, and it has. It's at 14.30. So I think that they will look at those factors, and I think he mentioned in the statement that in the short term, there are local idiosyncratic factors, even though he said he doesn't want to go into detail about what they are, which are not in the control of the central bank. And I think they will be cognizant of those things, that we do see fluctuations in the currency, but we need to look at sort of the long-term inflation outlook. And if they are anticipating sort of continued currency weakness, I think then they will react if the currency is expected to weaken over a long period of time. But as we know, the rand is highly volatile, and I think that they will take all of that into consideration before making a rate decision.
Let me ask both of you a question. Ian, you first. Had we not entered a technical recession, do you think the decision would have been different?
No, I wouldn't, because even if we didn't have a recession, growth would probably still be low. So if you look at the SARB's forecast, we still have an output gap. And I think it's hard for an inflation targeting central bank to hike rates while you've got an output gap. I think the risk that the SARB doesn't want to run, the worst position for a central bank is to have stagflation, so low growth and high inflation, and you probably want to avoid that type of situation. So, all things being equal, I think the SARB may have not even hiked, because growth would still be low if it wasn't negative. Yeah.
Mamelo, same thoughts?
I think, the recession probably did sway the arm of the Reserve Bank not to do anything. But I think at the same time, they will focus on what they're mandated to do, which is managing price stability in the market. And they will look at whether there are risks to the inflation outlook and act based on that. Historically, we've never seen the Reserve Bank actually hike rates in a recession. We've seen them historically hike in a downward phase, not in a recession. So I think that did definitely have an impact.
We're still certainly in that downward phase, and I mean, we'd get data out of the Reserve Bank very soon to perhaps continue to tell us that, although there's a lot that goes into telling us whether we're still in a downward phase or not. But Ian, if the economy continues in this manner, and yet inflation remains at higher levels, it seems, however, that 4.5 seems to be the key mark here beyond anything else. Do you think then that they will be forced to make some sort of decision on hiking or not hiking, particularly going down on interest rates, if growth remains as weak as it is?
Well, it's hard to predict what the SARB will do, because we don't know what the currency will do over the next 6 or 12 months. But let's say the EM contagion continues and we see more hikes in other EMs. I think the pressure will build on them. They may hike, but may only be in 2019. But I think what's much more important is the hiking cycle would be a lot shallower than what you would think. So we're probably not going to see 2% of rate hikes. Maybe we see 50 basis points of rate hikes or that type of thing. So it's going to be a much lower.
They've never gone that high. You know, you've never really seen them try to be that aggressive when you see an interest rate hike. So you think something like that is still a possibility, though, with the current Reserve Bank governor?
Yeah, I think they will have a muted cycle because growth is so low. Because the last time we really had aggressive rate hiking cycles was probably in the Tito Mboweni era when we had 4% cycles up and down. We're probably not in that phase because we are growing at less than 1%, and I think the prediction for next year is around 1.8%. So we're not in a high growth environment, so you're not looking for 3 and 4% rate hike cycles at the moment.
Yeah, that growth rate must be scary though, Ian. 0.7% now for this year. At some point there were some who had even suggested 2% for this year. 1.9% for next year, and then only 2% in 2020. That's still a scary figure.
It's a very scary figure because, I mean, if you actually think at our population growth in the country is about 2.5%, so per capita GDP is falling the whole time. But, you know, as you said, monetary policy is not the only driver of growth. We need, you know, fiscal policy, the budget to work as well. We need the economy to work to get back to reasonable numbers, and that's probably going to play out over time. But at the moment, there's probably limited scope what the SARB can really do to stimulate growth, and one of the ways is probably just to try and keep the repo rate at 6.5 for as long as possible.
We don't talk about synchronized growth anymore, Mamelo, because it seems the world is heading it in their own separate ways. At the same time, we obviously then can't talk about synchronized increases in interest rates by the seams of things, particularly if you take a look at us. Should we then be looking at what best suits the local economy and not even talk about cycles when it comes to hiking or decreasing interest rates?
Yes, I think, look, when financial conditions tighten globally and we start to see the cumulative effect of an increase in the Fed rates. Sure. Ian mentioned at the beginning that our real rate is still attractive, but over time we're going to have to think about, as the Fed continues to move, how attractive does SA still remain in that context, and also in the context of EMs like Turkey that at 650 basis points that are increasing rates quite aggressively. While we don't have to be synchronized at this particular point, and perhaps we need to focus on SA specific things, we also need to be cognizant of not falling behind and being less attractive when investors are searching for yield.
A lot to really consider, but as we said there, the breaking news is of course that the Reserve Bank Governor and the Monetary Policy Committee have decided at a 4-3 vote to keep interest rates unchanged at 6.5% for the repo rate, the prime lending rate at 10%. Mamelo Ngwenya, Chief Economist at FNB, and Ian Scott, who is the Head of Fixed Income at Momentum Investment, join me after the break as well as we continue to unpack that decision. Do stay tuned.
SABC is independent and impartial, and it's important that as we deliver the news, we do so without fear, without favour, without prejudice, and that we ensure that we get the multiplicity of views so that our stories and coverage is balanced.
We pride ourselves on being impartial as well as independent. On the agenda, we basically break down the stories of the day, give it more substance and give it more detail. So all in all, we basically take the news agenda of the day forward.
But more than that, we'll be able to reflect the stories of ordinary folk, people who are trying to make ends meet, facing the most incredibly difficult obstacles and circumstances, and that they will find that their realities are expressed on the SABC.
To be a part of something like this makes me proud, and I think that to be able to report the news in a fair, just, independent and impartial way is what the public broadcaster stands for.
Where am I going to sleep now? What about my kids?
There is bribe involved because we are not aware that they will come today.
People are being evicted about 2 months ago in May. We served the first court order. This is private property.
They came to us with a truck that has no water.
How do we build these checks in a way that we don't have a fire spread when we have a fire incident?
Welcome back to Market Sense. Of course, we've just heard not so long ago from the Reserve Bank Governor and the MPC that interest rates do remain unchanged at 6.5% for the repo rate and 10% for the prime lending rate. Mamello Ngwenya, who is the chief economist at FNB, and Ian Scott, who is the head of fixed income at Momentum Investment, join me in studio to continue to unravel exactly what has happened. Since the July meeting of the monetary policy, we've seen 7.3% weakness in the South African currency, but certainly not as much as our counterparts, the likes of Turkey, the likes of Argentina. But we were just speaking in the break that perhaps we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to these countries as much as we certainly are right now, Ian.
Yes, I agree. I think 20 years ago, emerging markets were a homogenous group. Now we've got a stock pick. We've got good, bad, and medium.
Yeah.
Emerging,
so they all acted the same 20 years ago.
Now it's very different. So I think it's very wrong to compare South Africa to Turkey and to Argentina. Why? Because firstly, we are still investment grade. They're not. Secondly, Turkey
only just.
Only just. Secondly, you know, they've lost control of inflation targeting in Turkey. I mean, because inflation was running at 18% and the bonds at 24% and wherever. Argentina, we know rates are at 60%. They've lost control of their budget. Now in South Africa, we know inflation targeting works. We know that the budget process works. We've got strength of institutions. If we look at our ratings, and that's why I think it's very unfair to compare us to the worst emerging markets. I think there are better emerging markets that South Africa should be compared to.
Yeah. Your sentiments, Mama?
I definitely agree with what Ian is saying regarding if one had to look at SA, I mean, the strength of our institution, and we look at the issues that we're seeing in Argentina and these economies that have large dollar-denominated debt, we don't have those specific issues. But what we did see in July and August is this contagion and just fear. And I think that also sometimes people lose sight of the fact that, you know, we're not comparing apples for apples.
Yeah. How do we remove ourselves, for lack of a better term? You know, when things go good, we want to be part of the emerging market space. When things go bad, we want to just be on our own. But how do we make sure that we have our own sense of identity in that emerging market space for our economy's sake and for perhaps our currency's sake?
I think to a certain degree we do. If we look at in the short term, sort of the short-term trigger were idiosyncratic factors that actually caused a panic or flow out of SA. So issues around, you know, land reform and what it means for land issues. So I think if we clarify all of these, you know, policy uncertainty, I think that will help SA to a great degree. I think it's a good thing, or a great positive that we don't have our debt in dollar denominated. The strength of our institutions, as I said, that's a positive. So we really need to really think about, you know, just making sure that we boost confidence, we boost external confidence into the South African economy, and you achieve this by being clear on policy. You achieve this by being clear on what direction we're taking as an economy. You being clear by sticking to sort of the targets that we've set in terms of our fiscal consolidation, and actually maybe starting to work at implementing the policies that will structurally change the economy. I think that's, you know, that's how we differentiate ourselves.
I think we certainly need to touch on the growth path and the growth strategy. Cyril Ramaphosa is set to put out you know, some projections tomorrow. But just before we touch on that, I want to ask you a very critical question, which I feel is something that needs to be tackled. Is a lot of what the Reserve Bank Governor spoke about today was around that 4.5% midpoint of the target band. Do you believe he's in some way abandoned the 3 to 6 target range and just decided 4.5% is it, and everything else is sort of, let's make sure we don't go there, particularly on the higher side?
Sure. If you probably talk to the SARB, they'll say, yeah, the 4.5 is sacrosanct, and in my mind it's a wish list.
But it's become recent though, hasn't it?
It's probably more of a wish list where they want to be. Yeah. I think the problem that we have is recency, that, you know, when the SARB says they want to go to 4.5, we think it's now. I think it's probably more over a 3 or 5 year term. I don't think we have to do it now, because you probably have to say to yourself, it's going to be very hard achieving 4.5% average while we are a twin deficit country. Yeah. And I think the 3 to 6 range makes a lot of sense while we are running budget deficits and current account deficits in our current reality. 4.5 would be nice to have when we, let's say, in a 2005 to 2007 type growth era, and the economy is really pumping, and it's 4.5%, 5.5% GDP, and taxes look okay, and the economy is great. Probably not in the current environment. I think we probably have to have high inflation just to try and stimulate growth, because if you're going to try and get to 4.5, you may have to kill the economy through rates to try and achieve a target.
Yeah. That's one thing that a lot of people may have feared, that if he increases rates today, he certainly kills off the economy.
I mean, look, if it's a 25 basis point hike, is he really killing off the economy? I think we just need to keep just our eye on the ball here.
Yeah.
The issues are, it's not monetary policy, it's not interest rates that are going up. The issues are structural.
Yeah.
And that's
he,
just,
and he noted that.
Yeah, so
He
that's
really
just the reality. And I think to put that blame on a 25 basis point hike, if it did happen, would definitely be unfair.
Yeah, Cyril Ramaphosa expected to announce his strategic growth plan. We've had everything from the new growth path with President Jacob Zuma, the NDP, the 14 confidence-boosting measures by Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba. Here's another plan coming to the fore. Mamelo, do you think this serves anything that will, you know, one, what does it have to have? Mm-hmm. And two, do you think we can actually believe in it this time around?
So I think what the country needs now, as you said, we've got many plans.
Yeah.
We've got many ideas. So we need to really start looking at prioritizing projects that have huge multiplier effects, that are going to create jobs and potentially get us to that 2.5–3% growth trajectory that we would like to achieve at some point. I think the budget last year did quite well in pinpointing those projects. They talk about removing barriers to entry. They spoke about, you know, increasing confidence, and all of those sort of plans then sort of you know, counted to around 3% GDP growth. So I think what would be great tomorrow is just to highlight what are we going to prioritize, what are the targets, when do we plan to achieve some of the targets that we've set forward. So just put deadlines and commit, and I think continuously communicate with South Africa that this is where we are, and we are serious about structural reform, and we're going to start small. Yeah. So instead of having, I think, maybe 50 ideas, let's condense it to 5 and really try hard, pump into that 5 and really commit. And I think that's when we'll start to see some momentum in the economy.
Ian, similar sentiments?
Yeah, I agree. So let's take the 5 ideas, get the buy-in from business, labour, government, how are we going to get there, and actually implement it, and it's not just a dead piece of paper.
I must say, you remind me, when you say 5, it reminds me very well of the new growth path, actually, which aimed at exactly 5 things as well. But nonetheless, please continue.
Yes, and let's get a buy-in from everybody, so we don't have a stillborn plan like the NDP. Let's get a plan, so okay, we're all committing to this, and we are going to make it work. And obviously the big key to the whole process is how do we get jobs going. Yeah. And I think the major key is to have certainty. Can we have certainty in the mining industry? Can we have certainty in agriculture about property? Can we have certainty? I think certainty is the one word that investors don't have at the moment, and that's what we need, because that will get the sentiment growing and let the growth go.
Yeah. Very final word from you, Ian. Cut, hold, drop interest rates at the very last meeting of the year.
Very tough call, because we'll have to see where the EM contagion goes and the rand goes. But in our view, we still think that rates will be on hold in 2018. Yourself,
Mamelo?
I would say, given the downward surprise that we've seen in the inflation numbers and very weak domestic demand, I would say hold until you see that there is actually second round effects.
Well, a hold for now, and certainly a hold for future, according to our guests here in studio. As I said a little bit earlier, and it is the breaking news of the hour, interest rates remain on hold, 6.5% for that repo rate and 10% for the prime lending rate. Thank you very much to our guest, Mamelo Longwenya, who is the CEO, rather the chief economist at FNB. One day, you never know. And of course, Ian Scott, who is the head of fixed income at Momentum Investments. That brings us to the end of Market Sense. Of course, the MPC edition will do this again in another 2 months, where we unravel just what happened with the MPC decision. Goodbye for now.
Ekurhuleni Artisans and Skills Training Center is a practical artisans and skills development center who equips students with the necessary knowledge and practical experience to enter the labor force as semi-skilled workers. There is a strong focus and need for skills training in specific areas like boiler making, rigging, pipe fitting, welding, CNC programming, plumbing, electrical, air conditioning and refrigeration, bricklaying, carpentry and painting at the center. Ensure your future today with the Ekurhuleni Artisans and Skills Training Center.
young people make up the majority of the people in this country. So why is it that the job market is filled with old people?
We also need someone who can help us with everything. Job opportunities are things that could do.
High levels of violent behavior in our schools, learners physically attacking other learners, learners physically attacking teachers, and teachers attacking learners.
The laws that are governing health today will all have to be amended and be changed. Nothing is going to stay the way it is now.
We are losing the best of kids. People that are fathers or pastors that comes from a church.
No taxi, nothing. We were not notified. I get to town, there's nothing. I think
Where am I going to sleep now? What about my kids?
There is bribe involved because we're not aware that they will come today.
People are being evicted about 2 months ago in May. We served the first court order. This is private property.
They came to us with a truck that has no water.
How do we build these checks in a way that we don't have a fire spread when we have a fire incident?
SABC is independent and impartial, and it's important that as we deliver the news, we do so without fear, without favour, without prejudice, and that we ensure that we get the multiplicity of views so that our stories and coverage is balanced.
We pride ourselves on being impartial as well as independent. On the agenda, we basically break down the stories of the day, give it more substance and give it more detail. So all in all, we basically take the news agenda of the day forward.
But more than that, we'll be able to reflect the stories of ordinary folk, people who are trying to make ends meet, facing the most incredibly difficult obstacles and circumstances, and that they will find that their realities are expressed on the SABC.
To be a part of something like this makes me proud, and I think that to be able to report the news in a fair, just, independent and impartial way is what the public broadcaster stands for.
I don't deny anything that is happening in Africa, so I'm not against any image being shown. But my biggest issue is that multinationals or people from outside, they only choose to show a certain face, and which is the hungry face. It's not running down the nose and the nose and the long neck, and the ribs sticking out, and all of those things we do have, and we have them in abundance. But there's also other things that we have as Africans, that are on the opposite end of that, and all of these things need to be shown in balance, so that we can really know where we are and where we are not. We can have a true perspective of where we are as a people. And also the other people can know where we are as well.
I think many films have been made about the continent, which have been very superficial and very much been about keeping the stereotype and try to simplify stories and lives and people. I think the opportunity for people across this continent to start really owning the technology, owning their own images and telling stories that really are about them, their authentic experiences, about their village, their community, their family. I think there is an opportunity, so I think that's what as a filmmaker working in Africa as an African, that's what excites me.
My feeling is always that we must move to the point where we're no longer just reacting and we're writing. Unfortunately, we're forced to always react because we go watch something and go, yeah, but that's not our image, I'm gonna go home and write the image. That's the starting point, because even if you recorrect the image, you still have to say something, or it has to be entertaining.
Since he ascended the throne of the Zulus in 1816, Shaka has forged one of the mightiest empires the African continent has ever known.
You know, there is a belief that Ushaka, you know, what he did, he was not trying to form a dictatorship. He was not trying to form like an African, you know, like a monopoly or something. But what he was trying to do was trying to unite Africans.
I think that there are two schools of thought, and I go between both. I do think some images have to be checked, but I also think that inherently you also have to, the image is the one that you see. So if your reality is, I wake up in the morning and there are people hacking people to death, as in war-torn Sierra Leone or these countries, that's the reality. That's to that kid or whatever, that's the Africa they're seeing. And I think we should see those images. We should see those images. As long as we understand that it's not an exploitative, it's, you know, as long as it's not through the gaze of the colonial gaze. Because the gaze of the colonial is a much more romanticized, or look at the poverty. It's a, you know, it's a distance. Whereas the guy who's in that poverty, when he or she is reflecting that image, you will feel it a lot more because it's something that's real. So that's always a tricky balance. But I normally lean to, let's see it.
How exciting is it to see this kind of conversation and debate going on among fellow Africans? It is healthy and progressive to debate and argue issues of our own prominent identity, which rates second to none. No one can truly define who we are but you and me. We are worth more than the flesh that is our mere bodies. We are spirits full of soul. Grab this photo album of mine and show the world what you know and how you feel. Go on, do it for your mama, my baby.
Did you know that Victoria Falls is a waterfall in southern Africa on the Zambezi River? At the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe, Scottish missionary and explorer David Livingstone is believed to have been the first European to view Victoria Falls on 16th November 1855 from what is known as Livingstone Island. Livingstone named the discovery in honor of Queen Victoria of Britain. The Victoria